All right, everyone. We had finished off Chapter 14 on Tuesday, and then today we are on to Chapter 15, which tends to be some of the stuff that biology students tend to like the most, talking a bit about how ecosystems and communities work together in order to best support different species, populations, communities, all of that good stuff. So what we find is that ecosystems are not just composed of the dirt or the plants or the animals. We find that ecosystems have living and non-living components that are equally important. Here we have an example of a ecosystem that is found in a non-obvious place. So we don't think of an ecosystem as being a pond or a rainforest, but sometimes we even find ecosystems like on the back of a beetle. There are certain organisms that live on the backs of weevils that are microscopic, that actually live their entire lives there. So we have lichens, which are types of mosses. We find communities in rotting wood. We have grazing animals that live on the backs of this beetle, scavengers, parasites, things that are microscopic. So we find ecosystems in not obvious places. And in order to suffice as an ecosystem, it has to have two essential features. It has to have both living things and it has to have non-living things. So the living things we call the biotic or biotic components. These are all of the living organisms within an area, and they're often referred to as a community. So as we take a look at this picture that we have, here we've got living things such as we see the fish. There are probably things like turtles. There are things like the coral that are living there. There's shrimp, there's clams, all kinds of different living things within a specific area. Then we've also got our physical environment, which are chemical resources and physical conditions. So as far as chemical resources go, the amount of available minerals, we've got sodium, we've got potassium, we've got our water, we've got oxygen, we have carbon dioxide, we have nitrogen. So those things are available to the species, and then physical conditions such as the rocks and the temperature of the water. And so these are the things that are referred to as the organism's habitat. So the components of an ecosystem are the living things and the non-living things, the biotic components and the physical habitat that those biotic components live in. So if I were to ask you a question, which scenario below exemplifies an ecosystem? Would it be a group of organisms of the same species living together in the same place at the same time? Different species interacting together at the same place and time, different species interacting with each other in the same desert, or a smaller species living on a larger species in a mutually beneficial relationship. So if we think back to what an ecosystem is, biotic components and the habitat. So one includes that, but it doesn't have the physical. 2 doesn't have the physical either. 3 has the species as the living component and the desert as the physical habitat. And so number 4 is 2 species, and it doesn't include habitat. So the thing that would be an ecosystem would be 3. And so we find that we have a variety of what are called biomes that occur around the world. Each are determined by temperature and rainfall. So different biomes around the world would have different temperatures. They would have a certain amount of rainfall that would fall over the course of the year. They would have temperatures that are either staying the same, relatively constant, or that vary seasonally. If you think about Northeast Ohio, we are pretty varied. We definitely have the 4 different seasons, so summer, spring, fall, winter. But when I lived in Texas, it was basically hot, hotter, and hottest. We never seemed to have too much of a winter. And then the rainfall relatively constant, or does it also vary seasonally? If you think about things like the rainforest or the Arctic tundra. So temperature and precipitation are going to dictate the primary productivity levels. Basically what that means is how much is going to be produced by that biome. So if we're talking about the tropical rainforest, we have a biome that's got a lot of productivity to it because the temperature is warm, the precipitation is high, things grow really fast, we see lots of varied species. But then if we look at something like the Arctic tundra, the temperature is very cold and it's not raining or snowing often, it just remains frozen. So you're not going to see the productivity level. The numbers and types of primary producers, if you remember back to when we talked about what is a primary producer, this was part of your lab on food chains and food webs. So primary producers, which are the plants that are getting their energy directly from the sun and they're producing food that the consumers can eat. We've got the primary producers being the chief determinants of the amount and breadth of other life in the region. So thinking about the tropical rainforest, tons and tons of tropical plants and trees. But if we think about the Arctic tundra, you hardly see any trees or any grasses or shrubs or moss or anything because it's kind of this barren wasteland. And so the Arctic doesn't have the variety of animal life that we would see in the tropical rainforest. So here is our terrestrial biomes. Terrestrial, keep in mind, would be the opposite of aquatic. So in a terrestrial biome, that would be the things found on the continents. And when we talk about aquatic biomes, we'll talk about the water found within the continents and then around the world in the oceans. So terrestrial biomes are large ecosystems that cover huge geographic areas. If you look at the map that's up here, you can see here we've got our equator, here we've got our South Pole and North Pole, and you can see that these large areas are going to be dominated by these terrestrial biomes. So something like the tropical rainforest is going to be found very close to the equator because it requires high temperatures and also a large amount of rainfall. Then we have things like deserts, which are also going to be found near the equator. You can see here a little bit above, and they are going to be dominated by very high temperatures and low rainfall. Then we have our savannas, which are found a lot through here, which are basically our grasslands without a whole bunch of huge trees. Then we have our temperate grasslands. Again, not a whole lot of trees, but not as high a temperature as a savanna would be. You have your temperate deciduous forest, which is going to be medium temperatures and medium rainfall, but enough to produce these large trees. Chaparral is going to be classified by a lot of mountainous regions, not a medium amount of precipitation, a medium amount of temperature. And then coniferous forests are going to have trees that make pine cones. So a coniferous forest has lots of evergreen trees that are producing pine cones. And you can see that those are found at very high on the globe. gosh, I lost my word. Our tundras, not a lot of rainfall, cold temperatures, and polar ice up here, covered in snow most of the year, and not having a high amount of precipitation and having a very, very cold temperature. And so if you look in your book and you're attempting to put together a chart as to what these are like, notice in this upper part here we've got high temperatures and high amounts of rainfall, and down in the corner we have low temperatures and low amounts of rainfall. And so we see the tropical and the desert and the savanna. You can set this up as a chart. Here we have our aquatic biomes, and aquatic biomes are determined by physical features like salinity, meaning the amount of salt, the water movement, and so how does it move around, and the depth of the water. So lakes and ponds are going to be found throughout the continents. Lakes and ponds have a low amount of salinity, usually not very salty. The water isn't really going anywhere, but they are very deep. Rivers and streams, usually low salinity. The water is highly mobile, capable of moving around, and the depth is less than in lakes and ponds. Open oceans, high salinity. The water is capable of moving like the ocean currents, and it's also going to be the most deep. In estuaries and wetlands, high salinity. The water doesn't move very much, and it's not all that deep. And in coral reefs, we have a kind of a medium salinity. The water is not going to move, and it's also not going to be as deep. So aquatic versus terrestrial biomes are found all throughout Earth. So one of the things that you need to be able to do in order to have a thorough understanding of aquatic and terrestrial biomes, you need to think about where they're located on the map. Always keep in mind your latitude and longitude. Always keep in mind the equator and the poles, and where different things are going to be spread out as far as their place on the map. And so if you said, which part of the world would you expect to find the desert? You would hopefully look towards the equator where you know there's a high temperature. Here you can see a desert region because there's not a lot of rainfall. And so if we look over here, that corresponds to the northern half of Africa. And I'll move on to the next slide.